new Sri Lankan saint. Thousands attend today's canonization mass in Colombo for St. Joseph Vaz. Determined assault. House Republicans take aim at President Obama's executive action on immigration. Back in print, we look at Muslim reaction to the satire in the newest edition of France's Charlie Hedbo magazine. And preparing for the Pope, Manila bracing for the massive crowds expected to greet Pope Francis tomorrow. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, January 14th, 2015. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick with your news now. Pope Francis presses his call for Sri Lankan unity and reconciliation today. The Holy Father celebrated Mass in the capital city and visited the war-ravaged north. Tens of thousands of people waving Vatican flags packed into Colombo's seafront park. The Holy Father rode in his trademark Pope-mobile through crowds of people taking photographs. Even many non-Catholics say they're happy the Pope is visiting their country. During Mass, Pope Francis prayed for peace between different ethnic and religious groups in Sri Lanka.
Religious freedom is a fundamental human right. Each individual must be free, alone or in association with others, to seek the truth and to openly express his or her religious conviction, free from intimidation and external compulsion.
Sri Lanka is the first stop on the Pope's apostolic journey to Southeast Asia. He leaves tomorrow for the Philippines. Continuing our Embracing Compassion special coverage of the Pope's trip, today's highlight was the canonization of Sri Lanka's first saint. People offered prayers today in front of a statue of St. Joseph Vaz on display at the canonization Mass. He was an Indian-born priest who journeyed to Sri Lanka when Catholics suffered persecution under Calvinist Dutch rulers. He would dress as a beggar and visit secret meetings of Catholics, bringing them the Eucharist and other sacraments. Pope Francis says St. Joseph Vaz teaches us to go out to the peripheries, making Jesus Christ known to all. Well, EWTN News Nightly's Alan Holdren has been following the Holy Father throughout the day today. He joins us from Sri Lanka's capital city, Colombo, where he attended that Mass.
You may not recognize this area at this point, but this is the spot where Mass was celebrated this morning with more than 600,000 people. There's no official number yet. It could be as many as 1 million, but I do know that the Pope took 15 minutes to go all the way around this area, greeting people in the Pope-mobile as he went along and blessing them as well. And when he got back to the altar, there was a special moment, which was that people in wheelchairs that were in the very front rows, the disabled, were invited to go up over the barricades to greet the Holy Father in person. Of course, they couldn't do that themselves, so they were lifted up physically, and they were able to greet the Pope himself. And there was another moment also that was very striking, very Sri Lankan perhaps, which was when the Joseph Vaz was canonized the saint, when Pope Francis pronounced his name. All of the bells across the city started ringing, and all of the altar servers started ringing the bells from their local parishes. They had them in their hands and were ringing them across this field. But the Pope doesn't just want this Mass to remain in people's minds. He wants his message of reconciliation to remain. He wants people to start speaking to each other. Here, there were more than 25 years of civil war, and people are still reeling from that. He's inviting them, Catholics in particular, to make reparations, he said this afternoon, for the sins that were committed during that time. Now that's a very striking message in this place where there isn't often a lot of dialogue between the different ethnic and religious groups. So the Pope is taking this step, and he's inviting the rest of the country to do so as well. Brian?
All right, thank you. Our Alan Holdren in Sri Lanka with Pope Francis. And while there, a nation still recovering from a long civil war, Francis is highlighting the role of Mary. Speaking at the sanctuary of Our Lady of the Rosary at Madhu, the Holy Father points to Mary as the ultimate witness of forgiveness. He says that she wants to guide Sri Lankans to greater reconciliation, just as she forgave her son's killers. One Benedictine monk echoed the Pope's prayer at the Marian Shrine.
Madhu has been a place for all Sri Lankans, all groups, all ethnic groups. So in that sense, I think it is a place of reconciliation, because our Blessed Mother brings all her children together under one shepherd, who is Jesus Christ.
Father Shimandra says Our Lady and St. Joseph Vaz can be considered the patron saints of the reconciliation process in Sri Lanka. And in true Francis fashion, this papal trip is not without surprises. The Holy Father paid an unscheduled visit to the recently ousted former Sri Lankan president. He also met rather unexpectedly with Catholic bishops of Sri Lanka, and Pope Francis becomes the second pope ever to visit a Buddhist temple. The Pope changed his schedule at the last minute, visiting the temple for a key Buddhist ritual. He was invited to witness the opening of a casket of relics of two important disciples of Buddha. Pope Francis listened respectfully as the Buddhist monks chanted and prayed. A Vatican spokesman says the temple visit is not considered normal, but it is a sign that interreligious dialogue is developing. St. John Paul II visited a Buddhist temple during a 1984 visit to Thailand. Some of the other stories our EWTN News Nightly team has been covering in today's world. House Republicans take aim at one of President Obama's top domestic priorities. They passed legislation today overturning his immigration policies but putting future Homeland Security funding at risk. Suzanne LaFranchi has more from the U.S. Capitol tonight.
Brian, the Republicans are keeping good on their post-midterm election promise that once they controlled Congress, they would try to undo President Obama's immigration policy. Today's vote, however, could be a double-edged sword. Immigration funding falls under the same agency that spearheads domestic counterterrorism.
The yeas are 236 and the nays are 191.
Despite a presidential veto threat, the Republican House voted to overturn President Obama's key immigration policies. The legislation would eliminate his recent executive order protecting millions of undocumented immigrants from deportation. The measures are part of a larger bill that provides nearly $40 billion to finance the Department of Homeland Security. Republicans say Obama's executive actions on immigration are an unconstitutional overreach that must be stopped.
This is not a fight between Republicans and Democrats. It's not even a fight over immigration reform. This is a fight over whether this branch of government will ever find the courage to stand up for itself.
Democrats accused Republicans of viciousness for trying to make it easier to deport immigrants brought to the U.S. as children and playing politics with national security at a time of heightened threats.
Not after the attacks on France, not after 9/11 when we pledged to keep the American people safe, not after we stood on the steps of this building committing ourselves to bipartisan cooperation and to do the right thing for our Homeland Security.
The recent terrorism in Paris is concern for many Republicans in the Senate, where the legislation's fate is uncertain. Some are worried about what message they'd be sending if Congress continues to toy with the DHS's budget. The agency's spending expires next month. If this legislation gets approval in the Senate and the president does veto it, passage would require another vote in Congress with 2/3 or a supermajority in both houses. Fewer than 5% of presidential vetoes have ever been overturned. Brian.
Thank you, Suzanne LaFranchi at the Capitol tonight. And Yemen's al-Qaeda branch now claims responsibility for last week's attack on a satirical newspaper in Paris. The top commander of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula appeared in an 11-minute video posted on the internet today. Nasser al-Anzi says the attack was in vengeance for Muhammad. The Charlie Hebdo paper published cartoons of the founder of Islam, which is an insult to Muslims. The video also suggests plans for the Paris attack have been going on for several years. Well, that satirical magazine goes back to print today, just a week after the bloody massacre. Jason Calvi is here now with that story.
Brian, Charlie Hebdo normally prints about 60,000 copies. Its first printing since the rampage has now sold out. The magazine expects to print as many as 5 million copies. But the front cover is once again causing controversy. The French lined up for Charlie Hebdo today. But all the copies were quickly snatched up.
I want my copy. Really, I want my copy.
The front cover caricature features Muhammad, Islam's founding teacher. He holds a sign that says in French, "I am Charlie," and above him the words, "All is forgiven." But today Islamic leaders in Washington tell us why the cover offends Muslims.
Muslims do not believe in graven images of religious figures, be it me, Muhammad, Jesus, Moses, Noah.
These leaders also condemn the Paris slayings at the hands of Islamic extremists.
They're managing to tell the world, see, the West is against Islam, the West is offensive to Islam, when in fact that is not the case.
But Islam isn't the only religion targeted by the satirical cartoonists. One image featured in a past magazine mocked Pope Benedict. Today, Catholic author Robert Riley joins the criticism of the magazine. He says, "Its cartoons directed against my Christian faith are among the most loathsome I have ever seen. I can easily imagine how Muslims must feel." Here at the museum in Washington, D.C., newspapers line the building from around the country, including Michigan, Minnesota, and today, one from France, Charlie Hebdo.
It's in a little bit of bad taste.
I think it's that these guys were willing to stand up to that kind of oppression to try to muzzle freedom of speech is a terrific thing.
And a paper in Turkey that used the image received death threats today. The Anadolu news agency reports a Turkish court is banning web pages in the country from showing the cover. And since the shooting last week, French authorities have been on high alert. 10,000 troops and 120,000 security forces are protecting Jewish schools, mosques, and other sites. Now, French police say as many as 6 members of the terror cell may still be at large. Brian?
Jason Calvi, thank you. Coming up, excitement builds in the Philippines with the Pope's arrival just hours away. And American astronauts bunk with the Russians as the International Space Station is checked for a possible leak. You are watching EWTN News Nightly's continuing Embracing Compassion coverage of the papal visit to Southeast Asia. St. Joseph Vaz, teach us to grow in holiness and to live the gospel's message of mercy. Pope Francis sends out this tweet after today's canonization Mass in Colombo. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. And the Holy Father is preparing for the second leg of his apostolic journey. He travels from Sri Lanka to the Philippines tomorrow. EWTN News Nightly's Susie Pinto and our team is already in Manila covering preparations for the Pope's arrival.
Brian, this will be Pope Francis's first trip to the Philippines and Southeast Asia. Today we had a chance to explore Manila a little bit, and there's one word that sums up the feelings of the people here ahead of the papal trip: Pope Mania. The headline of the leading newspaper in the country, the Philippine Star, says it all. Pope Mania sweeps the Philippines. This island nation of more than 100 million intends to give a warm welcome to Pope Francis in typical Filipino fashion. At the media center in charge of issuing credentials to reporters, volunteers and employees were hard at work today. Sky Ortigas, who is part of the team, says nearly 5,000 journalists asked for accreditation.
We are all very excited, though we haven't slept for almost 5 days, so preparing for all these things, all the IDs and all. But we're all very excited to see the Pope. We're excited to actually meet him, even we can just see a glimpse of him.
That feeling of excitement is natural since the Philippines is 80% Catholic. As a result, huge numbers are expected for Sunday's final Mass to be held in Manila's Rizal Park. And security is already tight, with police and first responders lining the streets. But the government says it's prepared to handle the crowds and keep the Pope safe.
All efforts are being made. No stone is being left unturned. We're doing everything that we feel is necessary to ensure that the Pope's visit is safe, secure, orderly, and will achieve its objective of unifying and inspiring our people.
Brian, this nation will be looking for healing and hope from Pope Francis. Typhoon Yolanda killed thousands and leveled entire villages in 2013. The Pope will be visiting that region this weekend and having lunch with survivors. In Manila, Susie Pinto, EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you, Susie. With Paul Fifield and Alan Holdren, they're covering our Pope's journey. Austria's constitutional court rules that same-sex couples have the right to adopt children. Previously, gay partners could only adopt if one of them was the child's biological parent. Of course, Catholic teaching stresses the importance of children needing both a mother and a father. With a month remaining for 2015 open enrollment, healthcare signups under Obamacare are falling short of expectations. The government's goal is 9.1 million, and right now the total is only 6.8 million. The administration expects a surge closer to the February 15th deadline. And Brazil approves the use of a marijuana derivative for medical treatment for the first time today. Brazil's health surveillance agency says cannabidiol is now a controlled substance and no longer illegal. It will be used to treat epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and schizophrenia, among other disorders. Well, we're seeing some new images tonight of the AirAsia jet that crashed into the Java Sea more than 2 weeks ago. The plane's fuselage has been located underwater just 17 days after it crashed. The photos show one of the wings is still attached to the plane's main section. Searchers believe many of the victims' bodies will be found in the fuselage. The flight crashed en route to Singapore from Indonesia with 162 people on board. U.S. astronauts evacuate their section of the International Space Station today because of a possible leak. An alarm indicating there was an ammonia leak sounded this morning. The 6-member crew moved to the Russian area as a precaution. NASA officials now believe it was a sensor problem, but the Russian Space Agency says it was a coolant leak. Everyone is safe, but the U.S. astronauts will stay in the space station's Russian section overnight. A judge rejects a bid to delay the jury selection in the trial of the Boston Marathon bombing suspect. Lawyers representing Johar Tsarnaev asked for the delay because of last week's terror attacks in France. They're arguing that the Paris attacks puts the Boston Marathon bombings, quote, at the center of a grim global drama, end quote. But the judge's decision today to deny means jury selection resumes tomorrow. Up next, we look at how money influences elections and continuing efforts to curb campaign spending. And an infirmed young man is placed directly in front of the altar at today's canonization mass in Sri Lanka. Thank you for joining us for EWTN News Nightly on Wednesday, January 14th. I'm Brian Patrick with our EWTN News Nightly team. Well, before the dust settled down from the 2014 midterms, the 2016 campaign season was already underway. It is standard procedure for corporations and PACs, or political action committees, to raise and spend millions to influence federal elections. Now, it hasn't always been this way, as we take a quick review of some key developments in the campaign finance in the United States. In 1971, the Revenue Act establishes the public financing system for presidential candidates. Then in 74, after Watergate, Congress creates the Federal Election Commission. It enforces limits on individual and PAC contributions to political campaigns. In 1979, amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act allowed donations to go to political parties rather than individuals. Then in 2002, Senators Feingold and McCain sponsored legislation to stop unregulated contributions to political parties. Then in 2012, the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Roberts, votes to allow unlimited contributions to political action committees. This opens the door for the so-called super PAC. Stephen Spalding is policy counsel for Common Cause, a lobby for campaign finance reform. 2012, Stephen, was a billion-dollar election. What do you expect for 2016?
It was actually a $6 billion election. Some say $7 billion. And the 2014, of course, that was a presidential. We're moving into 2014. We just got 2014. That was a $4 billion election. We're going to blow the lids off that spending in 2016. Corporations, wealthy special interests, everyone's going to be able to dump even more money into our elections, buying influence and buying access on Capitol Hill. But the trajectory in every election since Citizens United has been more and more money and more secret money.
Barack Obama won the last two presidential elections, and largely because he was able to use the internet to reach individual voters. What is the difference between individual voters donating and larger groups, companies, corporations, PACs?
Well, what we're seeing here are only individuals can donate directly to political candidates. Under the law, individuals can give a check to a political candidate and support their campaign subject to limits that are far higher than I think most average ordinary Americans can afford. Corporations, which under the law can exist for perpetual life, they have limited liability. We give them privileges under the law to make money. They then can use that money in our political system, and they can spend unlimited amounts that has to be independent of candidates, but that's really a distinction without a difference. If a corporation is going to spend $1 million saying vote for Bob Smith, Bob Smith is going to know exactly who to call and whose lobbyist to meet with when he takes office.
Let's talk about Dave Bratt for a moment. Here's a guy won against an incumbent who has spent a lot of money. He spent very little. Doesn't that show that the voters still have power over the big spenders?
Voters certainly have power over the big spenders. These corporations and others that are able to hire lawyers and armies of lobbyists to dictate policy are out there. David Bratt's campaign, if you look at it, he did run against special interests, but and it's true he ran a shoestring campaign. However, in 2014, over 93% of candidates in the House who spent more money won. If you have more money, if you have deeper pockets, you're more likely to win. And I just don't think that's the way our democracy is supposed to work.
But the Supreme Court has ruled that political spending is a form of free speech. Do you agree?
Political spending, money is property. I don't think money is speech. That was a 5-4 decision, Justice Ginsburg said. It was the worst decision of the Robert Supreme Court. Justice John Paul Stevens explained that corporations are not members of we the people by whom and for whom our country was established. It is human beings who vote, not ExxonMobil and not Coca-Cola. And I think it's pretty clear that money has bought and paid for way too many policies that are not in the public interest, and 80% of the American people agree.
The position of common cause from Stephen Spalding, Policy Counsel. Thanks for joining us tonight, Stephen.
Thanks for having me.
And millions could line the streets of Manila tomorrow to greet Pope Francis as he arrives in the Philippines. EWTN's Father Leo Patalinghug, a Filipino-American, visits with our Susie Pinto as they overlook Manila's historic cathedral.
So, Father Leo, you've been here on the ground in Manila for nearly a week now. Can you tell us what the atmosphere is ahead of the Pope's trip?
I would say it's excitement, not in a frenetic way, but really about a family excitement in welcoming home a relative. In fact, if you were to take a look at some of the signs, they have affectionate terms of saying mabuhay, which means long live, lolo kiko, which is a term to call the Holy Father a grandfather figure of sorts.
And the Philippines is a Catholic outpost in Asia. Almost 80% of the population is Catholic. Can you give us a quick snapshot of the Catholic history of this nation?
Yeah, with 85% Catholics and even about 10% Protestant. And they even have a little bit of the linkings to the Catholic faith in terms of its devotion. I know that the people here are excited to see their faith come to life. It all started about the 1500s when the Portuguese sailor and navigator Magellan brought the Catholic faith. It took root. In fact, it's been basically the Catholic outpost for all of Asia, and it's a familiar type of faith. It's a very devotional faith, and their love for the Holy Father is going to be very evident when he comes.
And Father, you've talked to people here on the ground in Manila. What are the expectations of this trip? What are the hopes of the Filipino people?
Well, I think they're going to be more than just the spiritual blessings. For sure, they're going to look for grace, which is real, especially giving people the encouragement and hope. The people of the Philippines are poor. They've experienced a lot of economic struggles and obviously a lot of natural disasters. So just the presence of the Holy Father will give them that added hope. But at the same time, when you get ahead of a state, and obviously someone as beloved as the Holy Father, it's going to bring with it the practical blessings of developing relationships with the rest of the world, some economic blessings, and at least also putting the Philippines on an international platform.
Well, Father, we look forward to covering this trip with you here in Manila.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
It's good to see Father Leo, and he'll help us continue our coverage as Manila prepares for the Pope's arrival. Sri Lankans are grateful for a special blessing received at today's papal mass. One in particular camped out very early to see the Holy Father. 20-year-old Romello Diaz has suffered health problems for 5 years, and doctors just don't know what's wrong with him. His parents brought him to the canonization mass in Colombo, laying him on a cot about 15 rows back directly in front of the altar. Our Alan Holdren was part of this. His father told us that he wants a big blessing for his son, so he'll be well again. Pope Francis did meet with several people who have disabilities before Mass. Tomorrow we cover the Pope's arrival in the Philippines as his apostolic journey continues, and we leave you tonight with highlights from the canonization Mass of St. Joseph Vaz in Sri Lanka. For all of us at EWTN News Nightly, I'm Brian Patrick. Thank you for joining us tonight. Good night, and may God bless you.